Welcome to Read by the Author, Season 3, Episode 2. Tonight we are continuing Time Anomaly, which we started last episode. Let's get back into the story. 3. Arrive and depart. 15 minutes later, Dr. Issa pulled the car onto a dirt driveway that led to a small, walled-off complex on the western outskirts of Metrahina, one of the modern Egyptian towns that lay within Memphis's ancient borders. She stopped the car in front of an imposing iron gate and removed a sleek smartphone from a handbag stashed on the floorboard against her door, tapping the face before holding it up to her ear. After a single ring, someone picked up. Thanks to my heightened Nezarette senses, I could hear the woman on the other end. Not that it did me any good. From what I could discern, they were speaking in Middle Egyptian, the same dialect that had long been the accepted standard language among Nezarette kind. In the 2 weeks that had passed since our explosive confrontation was set at Hatshepsut's mortuary temple, Marcus, Nephi, and Dominic had been doing what they could to help me learn to understand the spoken language rather than just the written version, but I had yet to make much, if any, progress in learning to speak Middle Egyptian. It was too different from Nguyen's ancient language, like modern Italian compared to Latin, to make learning it much easier than if I hadn't known Nguyen's language at all. I certainly hadn't progressed enough to translate Dr. Issa's rushed words. When she ended the call, the gate started swinging outward. Dr. Issa eased the car into the compound and parked in front of a modern boxy building. It was relatively small, tan, and appeared to have no windows and only one entrance or exit so far as I could tell. A heavy metal door with no handle but with a keypad on the wall beside it, about halfway up. It seemed high-tech, high security, and more than a little out of place. "Where are we?" I asked. "You'll see." The lone door opened, and a handsome, middle-aged woman stepped outside. She wore a simple white linen shift, her only adornment the single strand of turquoise beads hanging around her neck. She looked like she would have fit in far better in the ancient world than in modern times. Keeping her eyes lowered and her head bowed, she held the door open. Dr. Issa gave my forearm a gentle squeeze. "Come on, Lex. We don't have a lot of time." I glanced down at her hand, zeroing in on the rather exceptional bracelet peeking out from the cuff of her delicate sleeve. I couldn't see the whole thing, but I caught enough of a glimpse to tell that it was at least an inch wide, made of an opalescent quartz or some similar stone, and covered in engravings. It felt familiar. I had the insuppressible urge to reach out and touch it, which is exactly what I did. As the fingertips of my right hand made contact with the edge of the bracelet, a jolt of recognition flitted through my mind, and I suddenly understood the feeling of familiarity. It wasn't made of quartz, but of the very fabric of the Ankh, just like the chest from the hidden underground temple containing the Ankh-At, and the Ankh-At itself. I took a steadying deep breath and met Dr. Issa's eyes. They were filled with 1,000 mysteries. "Where did you get this?" I asked, fearful I already knew the answer. She smiled a faint, secretive smile. "From you." A shiver crawled up my spine. "I was afraid you were going to say that." Pulling her hand back, she unbuckled her seatbelt, opened her door, grabbed her handbag, and started toward the woman standing in the open doorway. I followed suit, stopping beside her at the building's entrance. "Greetings, Anai." Dr. Issa reached out to tilt the other woman's face upward. She was shorter than me by several inches, though still taller than Dr. Issa, and based on the fine lines marking her gracefully aged face, she was definitely human. "Much as I appreciate the courtesy, we really don't have time for such formality. I trust you've instructed the others to remain silent while they prepare her?" Anai nodded and turned away, motioning for us to follow her into the building. Once we did, the door shut behind us with a dull thud. Ahead stretched a long, well-lit hallway, wide enough for Dr. Issa and me to walk side by side as we trailed behind Anai toward another metal door. I leaned in closer to Dr. Issa. "What's going on? What is this place?" Anai and this ancient order of priestesses have been waiting for you for a very long time. They will make sure you're properly attired, and then you will—" She raised her right hand, wriggling her fingers to signify something flying away. "Slip into the past." Waiting for me? I shook my head. "But I don't know how," I told Dr. Isa, panic resurfacing. "What if I can't do it? What if I'm stuck here and Ep finds me?" He would kill me to steal my power. After our brief encounter in the bathroom earlier, I had no doubt of that. And then Marcus would die as well. And poor Set, he would be stuck as a prisoner trapped inside his own body for who knew how many more thousands of years. I glanced back at Dr. Isa. She had her phone up to her ear again and was speaking even more rapidly in Middle Egyptian. She met my gaze momentarily and nodded before turning away. Anai led me through a doorway in the far side of the room and into a smaller, softly lit space. There was a compact, minimalistic vanity set against the left wall and an intricately beaded garment hanging from a polished silver hook embedded in the wall ahead. Several pieces of extravagant gold, quartz, and turquoise jewelry, fit for an old Egyptian princess, were set out on a corner table that matched the vanity. Through another doorway, I could see a spacious bathroom with a toilet, a pedestal sink, and a classic clawfoot bathtub filled with water so hot it was steaming. Everything was white, from the towels and towel racks to the tub, faucets, and ceramic tiles that covered the floor. And there were women, 3 of them, each dressed like Anai, and each looking young enough to be her daughter. After a second, longer look at each of their faces, I thought they might actually be her daughters. They stood placidly in the center of the room, keeping their eyes downcast. Anai clapped once, and the 3 young women jumped to life. They hustled me into the bathroom, stripped me of my borrowed trench coat, and coaxed me into the tub. Hey, I can wash myself," I told them, knocking away their hands as they started running washcloths steeped in faintly floral, soapy water over my shoulders, arms, and back. They giggled, and one of them even met my eyes for a fraction of a second before blushing profusely, but they didn't show any signs of giving up on their task. "You must let them do their duty," Anai said from the doorway. "Like me and my mother before me, and her mother before her, for over 100 generations. They have trained their whole lives for the honor of preparing you for your journey. You cannot imagine the joy they felt, we all felt, when we learned that we would be the ones to fulfill our order's purpose. Please do not take this from them." I closed my eyes and forced my muscles to relax one by one. "But I'm just me," I murmured. Upon hearing Anai enter the bathroom, I opened my eyes, hoping that focusing on her would distract me from the 3 strange, if gentle, women washing my body. "My mother told me, as her mother told her, that when you finally found your way back to us, you would be confused. You would not remember us until your journey was complete." She smiled, but despite the joy brightening her expression, her eyes filled with tears. You are our purpose for existing. I cannot explain to you what it is like to be in the presence of the one who—" "Anai!" I glanced at the doorway, where Dr. Isa was standing, her arms crossed over her chest and her eyebrows raised. When my attention returned to Anai, I found that her eyes had once again drifted down to the floor. She wiped tears from her cheeks and took a deep breath. "I shall say no more." Dr. Isa exhaled heavily. "Wonderful." Minutes later, I was out of the tub, wrapped in a thick linen robe, and all but my hair was dry. The 3 young women situated me on a squat padded stool in front of the vanity and immediately set to work cutting and drying my hair and applying makeup. By the time they were done, I had a very proper Old Kingdom hairstyle, dark shoulder length and very straight, and my eyes were lined in kohl. The black galena liner only served to emphasize the reddish hue my eyes had gained when my Nezarette traits started manifesting. Anai arranged an intricately worked band of turquoise and quartz beads affixed with gold thread around my head. When she was finished, she smiled at my reflection in the mirror, looking utterly pleased with herself. "It is time for you to dress." "All right." It wasn't like I could refuse, not with my future past self breathing down my neck and Dr. Isa tapping her foot in the doorway. With the help of the young women, Anai dressed me first in a calf-length white linen shift of a weave so fine it almost felt like silk. After walking around me with narrowed, scrutinizing eyes, she gave a single nod and guided her helpers through the delicate process of attiring me with the beaded faience dress that had been hanging on the wall. The turquoise-colored ceramic beads made a net pattern that covered the shift from my chest almost all the way down to my ankles. Additional beads of quartz, gold, silver, and actual turquoise dangled from the garment's hem and adorned its empire waist and thin shoulder straps. It was an absolutely stunning piece of craftsmanship, far more intricate than any of the Old Kingdom beaded dresses I had seen in museums, not that many had survived the passage of time. Anai completed the look with a menet collar, a necklace often associated with Hathor and thought to be something of a good luck charm. Composed of dozens of strands of tiny beads that matched my dress perfectly and finished with hammered gold fastenings and a flat, heavy gold counterweight that dangled down my back. She also slipped a 2-inch-wide gold cuff bracelet onto my wrist, the face inlaid with a turquoise eye of Horus. Thinking of Marcus and how appropriate it was for me to be wearing his symbol, I squeezed my eyes shut. He must be freaking out. But this is the only way to protect him, to protect everyone. My heart started racing and a lump swelled in my throat. Opening my eyes, I turned to face Dr. Isa and held out my hand, palm up. "I need your phone." It started buzzing in her handbag and she pulled it out with a quick, Yes, in a moment." For the third time, she fell into a rapid conversation in Middle Egyptian, but this time her tone was more severe, her words sharper. One of the young women slipped delicate sandals of leather worked with silver and gold onto my feet, then retreated to the room containing the ancient temple sanctuary with the other 2 young women. "She is ready," Anai said when Dr. Isa ended the call. The priestess offered a slight bow of her head to the doctor and a far more substantial one to me before joining the other women of her order in the temple room. "Your phone," I repeated. "I'm sorry, Lex, but there is no time." Dr. Isa took my elbow and guided me toward the last remnants of the oldest remaining Hathor temple in existence. "He is on his way." "A pep?" "In Set's body, yes." "But how?" "I've had an exceptionally powerful Nejaret cloaking you since we left the palace, but it would seem Set has one just as strong." Her eyes narrowed to slits. "Not that it should be possible." "But..." "He knows where you are, and as long as you are here in this time, he won't stop until he tears this place apart." Her voice turned grim. "And then he'll tear you apart." "That cannot happen." Any response I may have been formulating died on my tongue. I nodded. We passed between 2 crumbling columns and into the inner chamber, Anai and the 3 young women following behind us. The latter positioned themselves around the chamber, one at each unbroken wall, while Anai remained in the doorway, and Dr. Isa led me into the center of the chamber. It was cramped and dark enough that without my heightened Nejaret vision, I wouldn't have been able to see a thing. I doubted whether any of the human women could. "Will you tell Marcus what happened? Where I've gone?" I asked Dr. Isa as she left my side to retrieve a small cloth-wrapped bundle from a niche in the wall opposite the doorway. "Please?" She unwrapped it carefully and handed the cloth to the young woman nearest her, then met my gaze. "Of course I will, Lex. I swear it on my life." As she returned to me, I recognized the object in her hand, a small statuette of the goddess Hathor. I recognized it because it was mine and was supposed to be in my apartment back in Seattle. "How'd you—" I shrieked as she smashed the priceless antique on the age-worn limestone floor. The alabaster cracked and fell away, leaving behind a smaller version of the statuette. but this version was fashioned from aught, and it was glowing. Dr. Isa bent down and retrieved the statuette with the quick gracefulness afforded a Nezarette and thrust it at me before I could even think of evading it. As soon as the statuette made contact with my palm, the world fell away. Part 2. Memphis, Lower Egypt, 6th Dynasty, Old Kingdom. 4. Hello and again. Warmth surrounded me, endless comfort and well-being. Shock and fear no longer existed. Impossible and possible were irrelevant. The events of the past few hours insignificant. I was insignificant, just a part of the greater existence. One piece, small, meaningless apart from the whole. I had felt something similar before, several weeks ago, when my presence had activated a trigger in the Ot chest in Senenmut's hidden temple, and I had been transported to a time and place Nguyen had created outside of the real, of the known. Since I had never experienced the sensation when I shifted spatially, I figured it had to be a part of the time-traveling process, which meant the Hathor statuette, the Ot statuette, had worked much like the Ot chest, transporting me through time upon contact with my skin. Without apparent cause or warning, the physical world reformed around me, bringing with it everything I hadn't missed while I had been floating in that blissful state of unbeing: fear, panic, loss. It seemed to take eons for my body to reform, and when I was finally wholly within the physical world, exhaustion flooded me. My limbs trembled under the sheer force of such overwhelming fatigue. I lurched forward, barely managing to open my eyes, before my hands pressed against a grooved wall. In the dim light, I could see that the wall was white and was covered in brightly colored images. Those images spun and lurched like the wall was no more solid than water. I squeezed my eyes shut, focusing on steadying my breath as well as blocking out the psychedelic vertigo. Deep breaths. The air was warm and still and tasted a little stale, though not unpleasantly so. I heard movement behind me a moment before fingertips touched my shoulder. My eyelids snapped open and I spun, which only exacerbated the dizziness. But still, I was able to make out the equally awed and concerned face of the woman who had touched me. It was strikingly familiar. Dr. Isa? Her eyes widened as my knees gave out and, once again, the world fell away. I regained consciousness slowly. When enough awareness returned that I could feel the various parts of my body, I registered that I was lying on my back on something like gravel. Opening my eyes, I found the same view I had had when I passed out. The worried face of Dr. Isa. It didn't work. I didn't travel back in time. But the closer I looked at the woman's face, the more I doubted my initial presumption. She was Dr. Isa, there was no doubt in my mind, but she wasn't the same Dr. Isa I had been with only moments ago. Her hair was different, and her makeup, and her dress, it was beadnet like mine. I squinted up at the woman leaning over me and, rather moronically, said, "Dr. Isa?" She cocked her head to the side and studied me. "I do not know those words. Dr. Isa," she said in Nguyen's language. "But we have met before, you and I, though you told me then that you would not remember our time together when next we met." She smiled, and it lit up her caramel eyes, even in the shadows. "You may call me Aset." Aset? The ancient name for the goddess more commonly known as Isis, who I knew was really Marcus's Nezaret's sister, who'd died in an attempt to rescue her brother from Set in the conflict that had inspired one of the most well-known ancient Egyptian myths, the contendings of Horus and Seth. But apparently not yet. Or does that mean she never really died, if Aset is Dr. Isa? You are Aset? I hadn't spoken in Nguyen's language in a long time, and I was definitely rusty. I had no doubt that my accent was thick to the point of being nearly incomprehensible. She nodded. Sister of Heru? I clarified. Again, she nodded and smiled. We shared the womb, in fact. I blinked several times. You shared the womb, which would mean that they weren't just brother and sister, they were twins. It made my heart bleed that much more for the loss Marcus must have felt after her death, or rather, her death. But how... I snapped my mouth shut, barely stopping myself from asking her about a future she'd yet to experience. We have met before? Yes, dear Lex, we have. She knew my name. How the hell could a woman who lived and was supposed to have died thousands of years before me have known my name? Realization struck and I narrowed my eyes. Nguyen told you about me, and this is one of his strange jokes, is it not? To say his sense of humor, or any other human emotional response, was different was a gross understatement. I loved the guy, but he was definitely one of a kind. A delighted tinkling sound erupted from a set, echoing all around us like we were in a small, enclosed space. I scanned my surroundings for the first time, focusing on the ceiling, then glancing around at the walls, though the only source of light seemed to be the doorway on the opposite side of the cramped chamber. I could see well enough to tell that the walls, likely plaster spread over mud brick, were covered in a glorious array of hieroglyphs and sacred images, mostly of Hathor, the ancient goddess of love, sex, singing, dancing, drunkenness, what most people would agree were the best parts of life. I was in the Hathor inner sanctuary, thousands of years before I had been in it only a moment ago. You told me you would say that, Aset said. No, my grandfather does not know of your arrival. Only I do. I propped myself up on my elbows and shook my head slowly. And you knew I would be arriving because... She pressed her lips together in a thin line. Now you are simply being obstinate, I think. My eyes widened. No, I really do not understand. Aset sighed. You visited me a long time ago, and what you did then... Shaking her head, she looked away. I must not speak of it, for I cannot risk changing what happened. It would be far too dangerous. She took my nearest hand in both of hers. Just know this. There is nothing I would not do for you. I owe you everything. My brow furrowed. Seeing her extreme gratitude for something I had yet to do was odd, to say the least. Come, she said, taking hold of my elbow with a surprisingly strong grip for such a tiny woman. Let us get you on your feet. I know how uncomfortable it can be to lie on a bead net dress. She turned her attention to the doorway, where another woman now stood wearing a simple white linen shift and silhouetted by bright sunlight. Deny, aid me in helping her rise. The newcomer, Deny, it seemed, said something in what had to be Old Egyptian, assuming I had made it to the target time period of 2180 BCE. Of course, since I didn't actually speak Old Egyptian and could only read it, much like with Middle Egyptian, this meant I couldn't understand her at all. Shaking my head, I told her as much in Nguyen's tongue, adding, Do you speak this language? She does, Aset said. Since the Hathor cult first came into existence many generations ago, I have made sure that every priestess who serves in this particular temple speaks the original tongue. You claimed you would not arrive until the death of our latest pharaoh, but I wanted to make sure we were prepared. She let out a soft, chiming laugh. Perhaps we were over-prepared. Once again, she stunned me speechless. Apologies, Deny said, kneeling to take hold of my other arm. Together they helped me to my feet, though my legs were still a little unsteady. Once I was standing, Deny continued to lend me a supporting hand while Aset examined the backside of my dress. You are lucky that none of your beads. You are lucky that none of your dress's beads were crushed, considering how hard you hit the floor, Aset said. Perhaps they are constructed of a more durable substance than faience? Certainly they are not all turquoise. I swallowed, then cleared my throat. Honestly, I do not know. I had thought they were faience, the fired ceramic material so many Egyptian artifacts were made of, but it was entirely possible they were just a lighter colored turquoise than the other, more brightly colored stones. Such a garment must have cost a fortune, Aset said, as she reached for my arm. She led me out of the dim sanctuary and down a tan mud brick ramp to a more spacious room. It was rectangular, and the white plaster walls were covered with depictions of the goddess Hathor in her various forms, as a cow, as a woman with the head of a cow, as a woman with a beautiful face and the ears of a cow, and as a gorgeous woman with cow horns crowning her head, cradling a crimson sun disk, one of the symbols of the main solar deity, Ra. A vast array of small items was placed around the perimeter where the walls met the mud brick floor. Some were tiny figurines of women, while others appeared quite phallic. They're offerings to Hathor, I realized, which made sense considering that I had appeared in the inner sanctuary of a temple of Hathor. Time travel seemed to dim my wits a bit. I was standing in an old kingdom temple, the likes of which hadn't survived the millennia. Mud brick wasn't the most durable of building materials. I was really there, not just viewing it in the ought. It was pure insanity, and the archaeologist in me couldn't help but get excited, despite the traumatic and shocking events of the past few hours. A woman dressed identically to Denai was standing at the bottom of the ramp. When I met her eyes and offered her a small smile, she shrieked and fell to her knees, bowing forward until her forehead was pressed to the mud brick floor. And I was pretty sure she was shaking. I stopped mid-step and looked at Aset, utterly clueless as to what I had done to elicit such a reaction. She gave my arm a gentle squeeze. You are not simply Netjar'at. You are like the Great Father. We can all see it in your eyes. You can see what in my eyes? The At, she whispered. My mouth went instantly dry. Nguyen's eyes had always been filled with a swirling chaos of every color, reminiscent of the At, but nothing like that had ever shown in my eyes. Aset leaned in closer to me. They believe you to be their goddess, Hathor. Hathor. It was one of the possible ancient pronunciations of the goddess modern people knew of as Hathor, in whose temple I was currently standing. With the way I had simply appeared in the temple sanctuary, not to mention the power they could see in my eyes, how could they not have believed me to be Hathor? Hathor. I groaned. And you did not think it important to let them know that I am not their goddess? Aset smiled mysteriously. What makes you think you are not? I simply couldn't respond, so I just stared at her. And when I considered that Hathor was the mythical consort of the god Heru, and that I was bonded to the Nezharet behind the myth of Heru, I started to think she might be onto something. Of course, the goddess was also recorded as being the consort of Ra, essentially the sun god, in various myths, so maybe not. Aset shrugged. They truly could not be more pleased. I felt like I was about to pass out again. I see. Besides, it is how Nguyen will be introducing you to the others. Laughing, she shook her head. He could hardly tell them your name is Alexandra or Lex. Nobody is named those things in this time. I opened my mouth to protest, but realizing that she kind of had a point, I changed tactics. Besides, I was thousands of years in the past and in about as foreign a place as there was. Being considered a goddess might come in handy at the moment. Swallowing, I forced a smile. You are going to bring me to Nguyen? Because I really needed to speak with him. And beyond that, I had always felt comfort in his presence, and I was craving some comfort right about now. Aset nodded and shifted her hand, linking her arm with mine. He should still be at the pyramid complex. We can go right now. Denai strode toward me, bowing her head as she stopped. We would accompany you if it would please you, she said to the floor. I glanced at Aset, who was watching me curiously. She gave another, tinier nod, so I told Denai, Yes, that would please me very much. Denai raised her eyes to meet mine, a joyous smile spreading across her face before she bowed her head again. Thank you, great Hathor. You honor us. I flashed her an uncertain smile. The more the merrier, right? Denai met my eyes again, this time a quizzical light filling hers. Apparently the saying didn't translate quite right. I sighed. I would have to be careful about that. 5. Farewell and welcome. I fell in step beside Aset as she headed for an open doorway that appeared to be the temple's only exit. It was wider than the one from the sanctuary, but neither wide nor tall compared to modern grand entrances. The doors themselves, little more than simple wooden slabs, were propped open against the outside of the building. Aside from the vibrant reds, yellows, and blues used in the hieroglyphs and mythological depictions covering the interior walls, the temple was rather modest. I paused in the doorway to take in my unfamiliar surroundings. I may have been an archaeologist and possessed the ability to view the past and future, though that was a skill I had only had for a little over half a year. But actually being in Egypt during the tail end of the 6th dynasty, just as the glory of the Old Kingdom was dying away, that was mind-blowing. I didn't know what I had been expecting, especially considering the lack of Old Kingdom evidence, ruins, artifacts, human remains, that still existed in my time. But it wasn't what I found spread out before me. It wasn't so cheery and filled with vibrant colors and life, a walled-in oasis in the middle of a barren desert. The temple was surrounded by a courtyard filled with date palms, fig trees, and some other fruit tree I didn't recognize. They lined the inside of the mud brick walls surrounding the temple and courtyard, as well as the rectangular pool extending from the temple entrance to a set of more substantial wooden doors blocking the gateway out of the courtyard. The broad steps leading down from the temple were also constructed from mud brick, as were the paths crisscrossing the compact courtyard. I followed one of the paths, heading around the right side of the pool, Aset still arm in arm with me, and the priestesses trailing close behind us. Stopping at the edge, I dipped the tip of my sandaled foot into the water, watching as the surface sparkled, reflecting the afternoon light. The water was lukewarm and exceedingly clear, unlike everything else in my chaotic life. It all seemed to finally be sinking in. Where I was, when I was, what had driven me here. I missed Marcus terribly, and I had only been gone for a few hours. I couldn't help but wonder what he was doing at that exact moment, thousands of years in the future. I couldn't help but worry about him. A black hole, a sucking void, seemed to be taking shape in my chest. I ached to be near him again, body, mind, and soul. I wasn't expecting this, I said in English. In truth, I hadn't been expecting anything that had happened over the past 7 months, and Marcus attacking me was one of the most shocking and painful surprises of all. I do not understand, Aset said. In my peripheral vision, I could see her tilting her head to the side. What saddens you so, Lex? I wiped my cheeks with one hand, swiping away tears I hadn't realized had escaped, and offered her a weak smile. I would try to explain, but it would sound impossible, and you would think me insane. Aset turned me away from the pool, leading me further down the pathway. You will be surprised by what I am able to believe, I think. I have seen and experienced much that is not quite normal, even for our kind. After a pause, she added, Do not forget that I already know you, even if you do not yet know me. I met her eyes. So you know about me, that I do not truly belong here. She gave my arm a little squeeze and nodded. I know that you are not of this time. As I said, you are not a normal Netjarat. You are like my grandfather, truly divine, which many would argue means you belong wherever and whenever you wish to be. I bit my lip. But I am not that. Not divine. Not really. I felt my eyes tense with a plea. You know that, yes? I needed her to understand. I needed someone to understand. I needed a friend. She smiled, and it lit up her beautiful golden face with warmth and affection. Yes, Lex, I know. Squinting up at the bright afternoon sun, I sighed. I thank you for that, Aset. It means more than you could possibly know. Ah, but you are wrong, she said. I understand quite well. We all need someone who sees us for who we really are. Otherwise, we risk losing ourselves completely. Again, I met her sincere gaze and smiled, knowing I would need to change the subject if I wanted to avoid a quick descent into teardom. I cleared my throat and flipped through my mental Rolodex of Old Kingdom rulers. All right, so the pyramid complex you mentioned, it is the pyramid complex of Pepi II, correct? I asked as we stopped at the heavy wooden gate doors. These were coated in a thin layer of plaster, possibly to make them appear stone, while those at the temple entrance had been left their natural sun-bleached color. If you mean Pepi Neferkare, then yes. Two of the priestesses stepped ahead of us to open the doors, and Denai slipped through the opening as soon as it was wide enough. I watched her scan the wide, smoothly paved limestone avenue on the other side. She shouted something in Old Egyptian and snapped her fingers. A young boy trotted across the street wearing a simple white tunic with all but a long, braided sidelock shaved off his head. He listened closely as Denai spoke, held out his hand to accept something small and cylindrical from her, possibly a seal of some sort, then spun away and broke into a sprint. I looked at Aset, my eyebrows raised in question. He goes to the canal landing to secure a boat for us. She smiled wryly. Shamu has been long and exceedingly hot this year. Again. I do not think you would enjoy walking all the way to the pyramid complex. She glanced at the sun, seeming to measure its height in the sky. No, we shall sit and relax under the cover of a canopy while some nice, strong young men guide us up the canal to the Valley Temple. I cannot claim that does not sound preferable, I said with a smile. I let Aset lead me out onto the avenue, relying on her guidance to keep me from running into or tripping over anything as I studied. Everything. I'd expected narrow, crowded, packed dirt streets that wound their way through a warren-like town, but what I found was a several meters wide avenue paved in worn limestone blocks and lined with tall mud brick walls like those surrounding the Hathor temple complex. There were few people standing or strolling along the avenue, and those who were appeared to be either youthful errand boys awaiting a task or priests and priestesses going about their priestly duties. Regardless, all were dressed in unadorned white linen, shifts for the women, baggy belted tunics for the boys, and for the men, wrapped kilts that almost reached their knees. Every single person who spotted us, whether man, woman, or child, averted their eyes and bowed their heads as we passed. Part of me hoped that meant they hadn't noticed my eyes. Why are they doing that? I asked Aset. To show their respect, she told me quietly. Whatever else you may be, you are also Netjarat, and they recognize this and honor this. Her eyebrows drew down slightly. Do not the people in your time behave the same? No, not exactly. In my time, well, we try to blend in. The people are not so accepting of differences as they are here, and they outnumber us by so much that if they realized who we were and what we could do, we would be in danger, as would they. Surely you would not hurt them simply because they discovered the Netjarat live among them. No, but some of them would try to use us, our gifts, and most likely end up hurting themselves or others of their kind. At her increasingly confused stare, I said, "It is difficult to explain. I come from a very different time." As we walked, I caught tantalizing glimpses of the upper halves of several different pyramids through the gaps between mud brick walls. Sunlight gleamed off their polished limestone overlays and positively sparkled off the golden benbenets, the capstones topping the pyramids. I had seen the pyramids of Giza in my own time, and though they were definitely impressive enough to have rightfully earned their place as one of the world's greatest wonders, these smaller pyramids, located in Saqqara, Memphis's city of the dead, looked so much more magnificent than their larger, shabbier, ancient brethren. These pyramids were in their prime, not yet stripped of their shiny, valuable exterior. "They are awe-inspiring, are they not?" Aset commented as we walked. I nodded without looking away. "They are impressive." "Well, you will get to see the newest up close." "It was long enough in the making. Dear Pepi," Aset said the late pharaoh's given name like she had known him well, which I figured was entirely possible, "has been building his complex for nearly 9 decades. Pepi II, the ruler modern history books marked as the last king of Egypt's Old Kingdom, was proposed to have lived into his mid-90s, a truly epic lifespan for his time. As far as we knew, he had inherited the throne when he was 6 from Merenra, who was either his father, his stepfather, or his brother. In my time, much from the Old Kingdom was a bit of an unknown. We were at least fairly certain that his mother was Ankhesenpepi, the wife of the previous 2 rulers. Probably. The sudden decline of the Old Kingdom, one of the first ever civilized golden ages, was an even greater historical mystery. Even Marcus was a bit foggy about the cause of it, and he had witnessed the decline of many civilizations. He had told me that several years of dwindling floods from the Nile, combined with the excessively long rule of Pepi II and his lack of any direct heirs, had led to a sort of civil war and perhaps the fall of the Old Kingdom. But the one thing he had been able to tell me with absolute certainty was that Nuin had died shortly after Pepi II, which was pretty damn terrifying from my perspective. Somehow, a statuette had been fashioned from the At and imbued with the power to draw me into the distant past, a feat I could only attribute to Nuin. He had to have been the one who made the statuette, the one responsible for me being here. And if he died soon, before he could send me back to my own time, I wouldn't be able to return at all. Not to my own time and not to Marcus. And without a steady dose of Marcus's bonding pheromones, I would soon start going through painful withdrawals, and the same would happen to him. And after that, we would die. Physiological codependency was the single greatest downside of being half of a bonded Nezarette pair. "You look troubled," Aset told me as she guided me around a corner. The street widened, and ahead a short ways, a waterway broader than I had expected for a canal came into view. I glanced at Aset. Concern lined her face. How much could I really share with her? How much did she know about who I really was, whatever she claimed? There was no way to know. I am travel-weary, I suppose. Tell me, was Pepi a good ruler?" A wistful smile broke through Aset's concern. "He was a sweet child and a kind man. He adored Ankhesenpepi and remained loyal to her until—" Confused, I stopped walking. "Ankhesenpepi was his mother, correct?" Aset shook her head, a crease forming between her eyebrows. "No, she is mother to none." I frowned. "But according to our meager historical and archaeological evidence, she was—" "Ankhesenpepi is Netjar-At. She has been queen and consort to many pharaohs, including the previous 3, and as Nuin's oldest living daughter, she is the highest-ranking female Netjar-At." I drew back, shocked. Oh my. I covered my mouth with my hand. That explains why Pepi didn't have any heirs. If he had been so devoted to Ankhesenpepi that he remained loyal to her, refusing to take any wives who could bear him children, then an heir had been an impossibility. Aset nodded and nudged me to continue toward the canal. Nguyen has long indulged her, but I think he is finally fed up with her endless desire for power. She lifted her shoulders and dropped them elegantly. He has come to the conclusion that we should let them. She pointed to one of the 2-story mud brick buildings on our right, where a human woman was shaking a rug out from a second-floor window. Rule themselves and stay out of their business, more or less. I pulled her closer and let out a small laugh. You see, that is the way it is done in my time. We coexist with them and interfere when needed, but we do not rule them. We let them make their own destinies, just so long as those destinies are not too harmful. The priestesses surrounded us, babbling non-stop, and Denai tentatively took my free hand and led me closer to the edge of the canal. Come, the priestess said. This is our vessel. Watch your step, please, Hathor. I released Aset's arm and let Denai guide me over the limestone precipice of the canal edge and down some grooved steps to a long riverboat constructed of bundled reeds and rope. God, it's like walking through a documentary. Except everything was more detailed, more gritty, more vibrant, more real than any documentary ever filmed. As the priestesses Aset and I settled onto lightly padded benches under a thick reed-topped linen canopy, reality finally truly caught up with me. Marcus tried to kill me, and now I'm in an old kingdom Egypt. Marcus tried to kill me. Dr. Issa is Aset, Marcus's believed-to-be-dead sister. Marcus tried to kill me. I can't go back until the spirit, Apep, is no longer a threat. Somehow I managed to hold in a whimper as I thought, I have no idea how to take care of myself here, and if I stay too long, if I'm away from Marcus for too long. He must be very excited to see you, Golden One, Denai said. She was sitting to my right, hands folded demurely on her lap. It took me a few seconds to realize that she was talking to me, using one of the titles commonly attributed to the goddess they all believed me to be. With all of the gold emblazoning my jewelry and my beadnet dress, I couldn't blame her, and unfortunately the beads were nearly as uncomfortable between my backside and the barely padded bench as they had been when I had been lying on the inner sanctuary's limestone floor. I closed my eyes, focusing on my scattered thoughts rather than my discomfort. What do you mean? I asked Denai. Great Nguyen. He visited the temple with Aset several times before the son of Ra, Pepi Neferkare, passed on to the land of the dead. His presence made the other priestesses very anxious, she said, as though she herself had been completely calm and collected in front of Nguyen. Hell, I considered him my first boyfriend, and even I wasn't completely calm and collected when I was around him. When I opened my eyes and looked at her, she blushed, but for once managed to maintain eye contact. And I am excited to see him, I told her. Aset touched her fingertips to my forearm and pointed to the left. Boats, some smaller and some larger than ours, were approaching, threatening to crowd the waterway. There was no way we could continue moving upstream. I frowned. A traffic jam delaying me reaching Nguyen was the last thing I needed. To my surprise, the priestesses stood, Denai in the lead. She worked her way gracefully between oarsmen, and when she reached the bow, she produced a glinting, palm-sized golden object from her satchel. The 4 other priestesses took up positions along the front half of the boat and procured similar items. As they raised them high, angling them slightly to the right, toward the sun, I realized what they were. Golden signal mirrors. The watercrafts ahead began angling toward the left side of the canal, like they were making room for our vessel. I caught Aset's eye. I don't understand. The corner of her mouth turned up. Consider it a perk of being one of us. The mirrors signal that the divine, usually a royal, is en route. Lucky for us, we are both, at least to these people. I watched, absolutely awed, as dozens, possibly hundreds of other boats made room for us, and we were able to continue on our way. By the time the canal widened to a small lake and our boat sidled up to the right side lake shore, I was so lost in observing this ancient foreign world around me that Aset had to physically shake me to get my attention. Some muffled part of my mind was screaming about how insane everything about my current situation was, crying out that I needed to return to Marcus as soon as possible to assure him that he hadn't truly injured me, but I could barely hear it. I felt detached from reality, though that could probably have been blamed on the unreality of the past few hours. Boats were still crowding the canal, either waiting their turn to pick up their passengers at the landing ramps or dutifully steering their way downstream. On land, people milled in the long gateways leading to the 2 landing ramps, some watching our boat and elbowing those nearest them to look or move out of the way, or maybe to do both. It was so strange to witness how aware the ancient Egyptians had been of the Nezarets living among them. I had been told about it, had understood that my kind were the basis for many ancient religious beliefs and mythological figures, chief among them the man I was bonded to. An unsettling thought surfaced, something I should have considered much earlier. What if I see Heru? How was I supposed to react? I wasn't sure it would be possible to pretend I didn't know him, that I didn't love him with every fiber of my being, that we didn't share a physiological bond that both of us relied on to stay alive. But the Heru of this time wouldn't share that bond with me, and he wouldn't even know me, unless, like Aset, he did know me. I wasn't sure if that would make things easier or harder, because soon I would have to leave to return to my time, to my Heru. It would be best if I never saw him in this ancient time at all. But it was no use worrying about what might be. I took a deep, steadying breath, shook my head, and followed Denai and 2 of the priestesses off the boat and up the landing ramp. The smooth limestone blocks were coated in a thick layer of dirt and sand that created a slick paste when mixed with water from the canal. Denai and the priestesses, who were all barefoot, didn't seem to have any trouble ascending the ramp, but the goop was hell underneath the leather soles of my sandals, and Aset was having similar issues. She caught my eye and raised her eyebrows, flicking her gaze down to her feet. Shoes always make this part more difficult. Then why not go barefoot? I made a quick assessment of the people who had stepped to the side to let us pass, and none wore any form of shoes. Ah, you will be glad of your sandals soon. She pointed to some of the people with her chin. They have all built up thick calluses that protect their feet from the sun-baked stone, but being what we are incapable of building up such a natural defense. So, we wear shoes to avoid the pain. She shrugged. Reclaiming my elbow, she hastened my movement forward. Come. Once we get into the valley temple, the crowd will thin. I glanced around at all the people we were passing. Though some of the men wore pristine white linen kilts identical to those we had seen in the temple district, marking them as priests or wealthier mourners, most of the clothing appeared slightly worn and more off-white. I have to admit, I murmured, I did not expect to see so many people leaving the temple complex. We passed through a tunnel-like passageway and entered a barren, almost empty courtyard. Aset glanced over her shoulder at the landing ramp. I believe this is the tail end of the procession, watchers, at least of those returning to Men-Nefer. She used the ancient name for Memphis, by boat. She gave my arm a gentle tug. Let us hurry. The Great Father will be so happy to see you. I was just fine with that. I needed to talk to Nguyen, to ask him how to shield Marcus so Apep's spirit couldn't take possession of him again, and how to get back to my own time. Marcus had claimed we could go a few days apart without any ill effects, but based on the withdrawal pain he had been in when Set had tramped my ba, essentially my Nezarec soul, in the At, I didn't want to test his theory. Despite my obsession with all things Egyptian, I zoned out as we passed through the valley temple and walked up the several hundred-meter causeway to the rest of the pyramid complex. I had too many other, more pressing concerns on my mind. At least the way was partially covered, providing some relief from the unrelenting desert sun. But when we reached the end of the causeway, I couldn't help but shake out of my pensive state and pay attention to my incredible surroundings. The priestesses headed straight into a cavernous limestone corridor covered in elaborately carved hieroglyphs, passed through with quick nods at the two men filling in a far section of engravings with an inky black paint, and strode into an open-roofed courtyard surrounded by an engraved colonnade. Instead of burrowing further into the mortuary temple, they took a hard right at the end of the courtyard and passed through a doorway leading outside. Aset and I followed. As we neared the opening, distant moaning and wailing disrupted the peaceful silence of the temple. I shot Aset a confused glance. "I thought you said the funeral procession was over." She snorted delicately. "It is over. The mourners are simply continuing their display of intense sorrow as they leave." The corner of my mouth quirked as I wondered if there was a prize of some sort for the most enthusiastic mourner. After the dimness inside the temples and causeway, the sunlight was glaringly bright, especially as it reflected off the pale, glossy limestone surface of Pepi's pyramid. I raised my hand to shield my eyes, wishing I had some damn sunglasses. The priestesses stopped near the corner of the pyramid, falling into a line with Denai in the center. As one, they tilted their faces up to the sun, lifted their arms straight above their heads, palms upward, and began singing. Their voices harmonized perfectly, creating a melody that was filled with both immense sorrow and great joy. I halted mid-step, drawing Aset to a stop beside me, and watched the priestesses, awed. What are they doing? I had never heard of such a display, either at a funeral or otherwise, but that was what happened when so little survived the millennia. I really need to spend more time studying the past and the aught. They are greeting Ra, thanking him for another day and mourning his inevitable death, and... She paused, watching as the 5 women slowly curved their uplifted arms as though they were holding a large round object above their heads, welcoming their goddess Hathor, who finally walks among them. Their slight shift in position suddenly made sense. They were holding something large and round, or at least miming doing so. They were using their arms as the cow horns so frequently depicted on Hathor's head, holding the sun disk, the symbol of Ra. As their hauntingly beautiful song drew to a close, they lowered their arms to their sides and folded their bodies as gracefully as any ballet dancer until they were prostrate on their knees, their arms extended on the ground in front of them, still palm up. "And now?" I asked. "Now they are bowing in supplication to the Great Father, the creator of all that is, was, or ever shall be." "Nuin," I whispered, realizing that meant he was nearby, possibly watching as the final mourners departed. Without thinking, I slipped my arm free from Aset's and broke into a run. I skirted around the priestesses, around the corner of the pyramid, and skidded to a halt. There was still a small crowd of people standing in the pyramid's courtyard, clumped in groups ranging from 3 to over a dozen. I scanned them quickly. It didn't take me long to find him. Tall, golden-skinned, and regal beyond comparison, Nuin still emanated the last few remnants of his power. He was stunning. He was a man who would stand out in any crowd, in any time period. He'd been staring at the priestesses, but his attention had shifted to me as I had hurtled around the corner of the pyramid. Meeting his eyes, I exhaled in relief. "Nuin." His sculpted lips curved into a slight smile, and he nodded his close-shaven head in acknowledgement. A handful of people stood around him, both male and female, but I didn't give any of them a second glance. Hell, I barely gave any of them a first glance. My legs started moving, a slow, stunned stride. It seemed to take forever for me to cross the distance separating me from this one familiar person, this one thing I could depend on in such a foreign time period, but I couldn't manage to move any faster. I stopped a few steps in front of him, my arms dangling limply at my sides. I had dozens, hundreds of things to say to him, but I couldn't think of a single one. Instead, I simply stared into eyes filled with brilliant, swirling hues of every color, eyes that apparently reflected my own. Tell me what to do, I thought. Make this make sense. Help me, please. My mind felt numb and I couldn't voice any of my desperate pleas. I could just stare into those mesmerizing eyes. A woman said something to him from directly behind me, but I couldn't understand her words. Mischief filled Nguyen's ancient eyes, transformed features that were so similar to Marcus's that it was heartbreaking, and a broad smile spread across his achingly handsome face. "Why, daughter, this is Hathor, my wife." Thanks for listening. That's where we're going to stop for this episode, and we will be back next week to continue with Chapter 7 of Time Anomaly. Until then, happy reading.